Without further ado, I don't think our first speaker needs much of an introduction. I'd like to call up Dave McClure, the founding partner of 500 Startups, to talk about startups go local or go global. Here he is, Dave McClure.
Good morning. That sucked. Come on. Good morning! I'm kind of pissed this morning because they scheduled me early, and usually I like to go out drinking on Thursday night, and last night was kind of early. I got to bed by 1 a.m. I was a really good student, which blows, so glad you guys all came out. I'm going to talk a little bit about going global or staying local, and might be relevant for some of you guys here. For those of you who came to hear me say the word fuck, there it is. All right. So this talk is a little bit about 500 startups and a little bit about building startup ecosystems around the world. And then I'll talk about what our framework is for investing in companies internationally and why we think it's great for some of them to stay local and some of them to go global. And we'll talk about kind of how we think about that. Here's the commercial. I was a geek. I was an entrepreneur. Kind of a shitty entrepreneur, had a very depressingly small exit in the mid-90s. Ended up at PayPal for a few years, made a little bit of money there, started investing some of that money in 2004, kind of while I wasn't really paying attention. In 2008, started working for a Founders Fund, and then 2010, started 500 Startups. Contrary to our name, we haven't invested in 500 startups. We've actually invested in 800 startups around so far. Probably at least 300 of those are dead, so maybe 500 startups that are alive. Probably like 50 that are worth something. We are a $100 million or so fund that's headquartered in Silicon Valley and San Francisco, but we have people all over the world. There's about 30 of us. It's not just me. About 10 of those are investing partners. We have a community of a lot of founders and mentors, and we do things a little different. We are primarily in the West Coast, in California on the West Coast, but we do have presence in Latin America, in Mexico City and Brazil, a little bit in India and China, and also Southeast Asia, and we might do some other stuff soon in other places. So about 5 years ago, actually before I started 500 Startups, I cooked up this very awesome scheme called Geeks on a Plane, which was my boondoggle way to travel the world without spending too much money. Over the last 5 years, we've probably done about 15 trips. We've been to over 30 countries. I'm actually heading off to Southeast Asia on Sunday to do our next trip. And I don't know, we've gotten to see a good bunch of the world and actually meet a lot of entrepreneurs and investors all over the place. And no shit, it's been very inspiring. It's really kind of changed my life. I'm not a young dog. By the time I was 40, I really had not left the country more than 5 or 6 times, maybe a few times to Japan. I have some family over there from my wife. But starting about 4 or 5 years ago, I started traveling a lot. I now visit probably 20 countries or more a year. Probably already been in about 10 countries this year, and I'm on the road about 6 months out of the year. So why do we do that? We're a little different than the average Silicon Valley investment group in a lot of ways, but our belief is that really there's great opportunities to start companies all over the world. A lot of the reasons why there are more startups getting started is costs of developing businesses, or at least the first couple of years of products, are relatively inexpensive. And there's lots of people online, not just in developed markets, but in developing markets all over the place. Last time I checked, there were probably about 6.7 billion people that didn't live in the US, and a lot of them don't speak English. So English is a global language, whether you like it or not. Sorry, fuck you. But there are at least 3 or 4 other global languages that have hundreds of millions of speakers, primarily Mandarin, which is probably spoken by 1 billion or more people. But Spanish and Arabic in particular also, probably 300 to 500 million speakers, depending on how you count that, and then a bunch of others. There's a lot of reasons why you might want to stay local, some that you might want to go global. I think the prevailing thought pattern from a lot of startups is going global is a must, and we tend to disagree with that, particularly if you live in a country of 50 million or more developed markets or 100 million more undeveloped markets. But there are some things that are important in places where you want to try and get started. Most of that is due to population and market, but also availability of capital, access to other entrepreneurs and investors. Really, in particular, access to capital at incubation, seed, and Series A. But there are several dramatic things that have changed in the last 5 or 10 years that are making international markets much more appealing, and that's getting better and better. We're not all the way there yet, but over the next 5 to 10 years, you'll probably see a significant leveling of the playing field, at the very least in terms of markets and customers, which is already happening, but also in terms of availability of capital and access to entrepreneurial mentorship and information. Some of this I'm guessing you probably are already aware of. So there's kind of two different ways that we look at the world. One is in terms of languages, the other is in terms of countries and markets. Again, we have a specific emphasis on probably 4 global languages. English, which is probably a native language to maybe 1 billion or more speakers, and probably a second language to at least 3 billion or more speakers, and that's probably growing. But most of those first language speakers, we've kind of already saturated that market at least a little bit. They're mostly online, they have a high GDP, but it's not really growing dramatically more than that. There is growth and adoption of those services, but those populations are modestly growing or somewhat flat. Mandarin, the population is probably underreported, but it's probably still not growing that much. So you have maybe 1 billion Mandarin speakers. A lot of them are actually learning English, although some of us are learning Mandarin. A lot of them are online already. There probably are more to come online, but again, that market's going to tap out fairly soon. There's GDP growth in that general country and speakers, so it's still interesting. But then the two that we spend a lot of time thinking about that most people tend to overlook are Spanish and Arabic. Those are probably on their way to 500 million speaker markets. Not all of them are online, and GDP is modest to low in many of those areas. Why is that a good thing? It means that most of the growth and opportunity is out in front of us. And then there's lots of other places that are interesting to invest, not just those big markets, but several countries that have 50 to 100 million population that are developed, places like Japan and Korea, Brazil and Germany, Russia. And then others that are very large and still developing, Brazil and India, a lot of places in Africa, Nigeria, Pakistan, etc. We're not in all of those places yet, but we have invested in over 40 countries around the world. In terms of thinking about them geographically, there's maybe 7 or 8 large collections of markets. There's probably more likely around 100 metros that are interesting, 50 to 100 metros now, and probably on the way to 200 to 500 metros over the next 5 to 10 years. We tend to think a little bit more in terms of metros these days, but there are still country borders and currencies and other regulatory and tax environments that do make us think in terms of countries. So I think of the ones listed there, we've probably done investments in most all of those, at least 10 or more. Africa, we've only invested in an incubator in Nairobi and one company in Ghana that came to the US. So Africa is still a wide open market for us, but the others we've been fairly active in, certainly in the US and Europe, quite a number of them. We've been spending a lot of time in Southeast Asia, Middle East and Latin America, and somewhat in India, not in Pakistan yet. So here's how we think about global markets. A way to sort of assess the available opportunity is the number of people who are speaking a language or in a geography, the number of people or percentage of people who have access to the internet, and that could be based on different devices. Could just be SMS, but it could also be smartphones. There's probably about 3 billion phones, maybe on its way to 4 billion around the world. Probably about 50% of those or so are smartphones or have access to the web. And then also thinking about GDP or available spend online. Some of that's disposable income, some of it's not. Some of it's very critical for a lot of people who are not high net worth. But then if you take those 3 factors, the number of people, the percentage of internet penetration based on a particular device, and available GDP or available spend per person, you get sort of an aggregate amount of money online to be spent in a particular geography or language or area. And then looking at the growth rates of each of those 3 factors, we can sort of have an estimate of whether that market's interesting for us now or in the future. There's a lot of other things that contribute to whether those markets are interesting. Sometimes that's, again, based on the currency of the country. Sometimes it's a culture. So when we think about the Middle East market, we could think about Arabic speakers. We could think about high net worth Arabic speakers, which might be GCC countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE. But then there's also other large countries. So Egypt is also an Arabic speaking market, not as high GDP. If we extend that to not be just Arabic and we think about Islamic culture, that's probably another 500 million speakers. And you add in places like Iraq and Pakistan and Indonesia and Malaysia that do speak other languages but share some culture. A very important one is whether payment methods are available online. So in addition to people who have access to the internet, whether they can pay for those things online or not, or whether there's a method for them to pay based on delivery, that might be cash on delivery or some other method. That's important for a lot of e-commerce companies. And then there's other stuff around physical goods delivery and social media. One thing that's also important to think about in countries like Brazil and India and China, there's a wide dispersion of net worth within the population, and you might have 1 to 10% of the market that's very high net worth, could be 50 to 100,000 US GDP equivalents. You might have another 20 to 40% of the market that's middle class, by middle class, let's say between $5,000 to $20,000 US GDP. And then you might have a very large percentage of the market, maybe hundreds of millions of folks, who you would normally consider poor, but they probably do have access to some internet devices, either on a shared or rented basis, or access to mobile phones that have SMS. And so they're not as inaccessible as you might think, even if they don't have access to a regular web-capable device, and even if they don't have an online payment method. In large enough numbers, those poor, quote-unquote, markets are quite substantial and interesting. There's a company in India called Redbus that basically does reservations for bus systems, and like we probably occasionally schedule flights, they schedule reservations on buses that have detail level down to the individual seat, whether seats are connected or not. You might even know whether there's a divider between the seat. If you're bringing a child with you, you might want to not have a divider there. And that company was acquired for over $100 million about a year ago. So there's actually really, really interesting markets to go after, and almost 3 markets in one in some of those countries. This talk is not going to work because I've got 5 minutes left and about 20 slides, so I should start saying fuck a lot more. So the thing that I want to impress upon you is a lot of these markets are connected in more ways than you think based on access to online platforms. And again, this is something that's kind of obvious, but most people don't think about those online platforms as ways to do customer acquisition. They may think about search and social platforms, particularly Google, Facebook, and now maybe Twitter, as ways to get access to customers. But how many of you know the icons on the far, I guess, right from your position? Do you know what those are? Anybody want to yell out what the top 1 or 2 are there? WeChat and WhatsApp, and what's notable about WhatsApp? 10% of Mark Zuckerberg's net worth, or probably more. $19 billion for WhatsApp, probably $4 billion in cash, and another 14 or 15 billion in redistribution of Facebook stock. Probably about 300 or 400 million people active on that. Why the fuck do you pay $19 billion for WhatsApp? You think that was a good deal or not? No! Who said no? Raise your hand, stand up. Defend your position. Come on, don't be a pussy. I'm sorry. Well, don't be. See, I get in trouble. I get in trouble all the fucking time for this. I'm sorry. Don't be an asshole. Sorry, is that a gender neutral term? Sorry, go ahead, please. You think they could have developed it internally for the same amount? They were developing it. It was called Facebook Messenger. WhatsApp was not free in all markets. I believe it was $1 in certain markets, or maybe after a year. But I believe they were making money. They were not focused on making money. They were focused on growth. WeChat also. So, I mean, the main reason was they had international coverage, but not as much as WhatsApp. Also, if you think about it from a photo distribution perspective, WhatsApp, I believe at the time, sorry, I'm not sure of the numbers, but 300 or 400 million photos a month, which was rivaling them, and also the reason they were going after Snapchat, also a very large amount of photo sharing online. WeChat in China is now starting to do a lot of monetization. People are actually starting to pay using that device. So there's a lot of reasons why messaging platforms are now starting to be a widely accessible device for a lot of people around the world, and probably in another 3 to 5 years, a widely accessible payment platform for people around the world. So we tend to look at customer platforms that have reach of at least 100 million, and interestingly, when they get to 500 million or 1 billion. So the platforms that I've noted here, some of them are infrastructure related, but a lot of them are customer reach. Search, social, and mobile, certainly. So Google, Facebook, Twitter, Apple, and Android. In China, you might be thinking about Baidu and Tencent, Alibaba, and Qihoo360 and others, maybe different ones in Russia or Korea. But there are starting to be global platforms. And those happen in content as well. YouTube for video, Pinterest and Instagram and photos, music platforms. So there's probably at least 5, maybe up to 15 or 20 platforms that have 100 million user reach or more. And some of them have accessibility of payment as well. I'm not saying that we're interested in building the next one of those platforms. What I'm talking about is the use of those platforms to get access to customers. So now I'll try and finish the rest of my talk in 2 minutes. So why you should not go global. You're a tiny little startup and you don't speak the language of the global territory you're going to, but your local market is big enough. In particular, if you live in a place like Japan, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, maybe Mexico, or one of the larger Western European countries, maybe Russia or Korea, there's probably 50 million to 100 million or more people in your geography who are relatively high net worth, have access to a device, and there's plenty of fucking market. You don't need to go global. I meet lots of entrepreneurs from Japan and Korea who are like absolutely all about going to the US, and they are desperately unprepared for that market. Now, that's not to say that we're not going to invest in companies in those countries that are coming to the US. We have. It's just not a very good value prop for most of those people. Now, they're still going to do it, and I give them props for going after that. Sorry, did I lose my slides here? Anyway, my point is, back up. Point is, a lot of those people are not steeped in that culture. And getting steeped in that culture, being able to sell to those markets, particularly if you're not doing a completely online service, if you have some direct sales component or a need to interact with people, you need to understand the language and culture. And that's not just a taken for granted thing. There's a ton of people who think they actually speak English quite well, but aren't actually understandable to folks like me who grew up in West Virginia and like, what the fuck did you say? I have no idea what your goddamn language is. Anyway, I was born in West Virginia. I'm not imitating someone else. That's actually, well, probably a little bit testy. So for certain large enough markets, you do not have to go global. You may still choose to go global, but I would say probably develop your product or service in your local market first, and then you may choose to go other places. Right now, we're looking at a lot of entrepreneurs in Saudi Arabia, or people in the Arabic-speaking market who want to go to Saudi Arabia. Only 30 million people, but very high net worth. They spend a ton of time online. They watch the most amount of mobile video in the fucking world. Same thing in Japan and Korea and other places. Japan and Korea, it's some of the highest ARPU mobile games, really, really great access to customers locally. By the way, you may also have kids and family and other reasons why you don't want to leave. Why you should go global. If you live in a very small country and your local investors might be too conservative, don't write enough checks, there may be a lot of reasons to go global, in particular if you just love California, like I do. Because California's fucking awesome. I admit that. It's big. The US, EU, and China are very huge markets. There's a lot of rich and online customers there. In Silicon Valley in particular, there's a lot of investors and platforms that are accessible. So you may be going there for other reasons than just the market. You might be going there for the investors. You might be going there for talent. You might be going there for partnerships. Probably a lot of those online platforms that I talked about a third to a half of them are in a 30-mile radius of San Francisco. Also, again, if you watch too many action movies and rap videos, you might want to come to California. I don't begrudge you that. And New York City if you like watching Kim Kardashian's butt. One thing that I will plug, I'm an investor in AngelList. It's a platform that's mostly been US-centric, but it is now a global platform. They're hiring people around the world. If you ask me to invest in your company, probably the first thing I'll ask you is, do you have a profile on AngelList? And that doesn't matter whether you're in the US or not. In fact, it's probably even more important if you're not in the US to have a platform on profile on AngelList. So again, when we think about ecosystem factors, there's a lot of things going on, not just the market. And everybody talks about creating their own version of Silicon Valley, and most people think that's very hard to do. I would agree, but we are making substantial progress. A lot of times people are a little too impatient about creating their own Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley probably took about 50 to 70 years to develop. The underpinnings and foundations of Silicon Valley started around World War II, plus or minus. Certainly by the 50s and 60s, there were a lot of things happening in Silicon Valley that were interesting that created that situation later. If you're familiar with Fairchild Semiconductor and the Traitorous Eight, a lot of Silicon Valley venture firms and early entrepreneurs came out of the semiconductor industry and successes that happened in the 60s and 70s. And then a legal ruling change around large financial investors in around 75, I believe, changed the accessibility of capital for venture capital firms, and that spurred a huge ton of growth in venture capital firms in the Valley. In addition to that, there's lots of things that are required. Obviously, a peer group of entrepreneurs, hopefully about a generation ahead of you, would be extremely helpful in terms of knowledge and mentorship. Those folks might also be angel investors. You want access to universities and companies for people who already have talent. The simple infrastructure of capital, legal, and finance is pretty critical. And then you have other things that are more market factors, whether you're going after customers or monetization. One that's often overlooked is the availability of exits, or at least liquidity. And what I mean by that is a lot of people focus on the front end of the funnel and how money gets into companies. What's far more important, at least to investors, is the ability to exit or a healthy M&A market. Right now, that's been pretty limited internationally. China is developing pretty rapidly in that area, maybe the EU, but most other places outside the US, EU, and China, it's very difficult for companies to find an exit in a local IPO market, and there's not much of an M&A market. That part should change over the next 5 to 10 years. I'm not suggesting there's going to be a lot of tech acquisitions, but I think there's a lot of offline companies that are large and public that will start acquiring their internet counterparts. So if you look at the Silicon Valley ecosystem, it's kind of like fleshed out pretty well. There's hundreds of venture capital firms. There's probably thousands of angel investors just in the California area. And then there's all sorts of incubators, of which we are one, YC, Techstars, and others. And then even other platforms for bootstrap funding, Kickstarter, Indiegogo, et cetera. That environment is very filled in Silicon Valley, New York, maybe in the US, and a few international markets. But in a lot of places, access to seed capital and Series A capital are still challenging. There may be lots of incubators and first money in, but there's typically a gap between maybe the $2,500, $1,000 investment mark and the $2 to $5 million investment mark. And that's where most of the challenges are in these companies getting funding. An example startup ecosystem might start with 1,000 bootstrap startups, and that might be enough to get you a couple of mature IPOs. These are sort of made-up numbers. There's no explicit funnel or data that I'm referring to here. But it's important to think about how each of those levels are filled in, particularly at the accelerator, seed stage, and Series A stage. That's what I'm talking about. There's typically a lack of access to capital. Most of the international markets fill in with capital at the very bottom first, and maybe at the top a little bit, but those risky stages where the companies are getting started but haven't really shown sustainable monetization or growth are where there's the most challenges and probably the riskiest capital going on. One thing I will point out is that most people who are investing in international markets think that the entrepreneurs are full of shit and that that's the problem in international markets. That our entrepreneurs aren't as good as Silicon Valley, they're not as experienced, they don't really have their act together, and that is bullshit. The investor side of the equation is far more where education and maturity is required. Entrepreneurship starting level around the world. There's maybe a lot more access to mentorship and education in Silicon Valley, but otherwise, the availability of education for entrepreneurs, pretty uniform around the world as long as you have an internet connection. And so the same things that we are teaching people about in the Valley are accessible to other people. So functional prototypes, lean startup, access to design and UX, online marketing. I've noticed that I've scratched out business plans because I think that's bullshit, and investors who are asking for business plans have their heads up their asses. But why do I say that? Why do you think business plans are full of shit? Why do you think I think business plans are full of shit? Over-engineering for outcomes that are not predictable. Business plans are typically 5-year roadmaps for predictable businesses that have known monetization. That is completely inappropriate for startups, which are usually unknown product, unknown market, unknown monetization, tons of variability in product and service changes over the first 6 to 18 months. Why the fuck are you building a 5-year plan for something that you don't know the last bit about product, customer, market, monetization? Doesn't make any goddamn sense. If you're writing a business plan of 10 to 20 pages, you're over-engineering for an unpredictable outcome. I'm not saying that because there's not interesting things in the business plan, but if I'm reading a business plan, it's basically about your ability to write an interesting script. You're basically doing entrepreneurial theater. It's not anything related to reality. What do we care about for reality? We care about for unit economics, we care about customer acquisition costs, we care about you experimenting with a product that has a barely functional prototype and testing for some type of demographic and customer segments. And if you figure out something that's interesting in one of those customer segments, then we want you to really focus on that and try and scale that up. So business plans, piece of shit. If you're an investor in the audience, don't ask for them. If you're an entrepreneur, have something prepared to give to them. Revenue projections are also bullshit, but again, they'll ask for them, but don't pay attention to yourself. On the investor side, investors, particularly international, mostly come from high net worth positions that are not related to tech. They're in real estate, oil, gas, textiles, whatever. Startups are not real estate. If you are a real estate investor and you are getting into the startup world, you're going to fuck that up 10 different ways. Mostly, you're going to concentrate too much capital in too small a portfolio, and you're not going to take advantage of any diversification. Most startups fail. In fact, probably more than 50% of startups fail, and barely 10 to 20% of startups are the ones where you actually make money. If it's the case that only 5 to 20% of startups really make money, and maybe only 1 to 5% make a lot of money, mathematically speaking, you should be investing in probably at least 20 startups, and arguably 50 to 100 or more. Take note, the name of our company is 500 Startups. So while it is true that there are power law returns, you don't really have access to kind of that small percentage of unicorns unless you're doing a diverse portfolio of 20 or more investments. Most traditional non-tech investors don't understand that. The immediate way they could benefit their portfolio is probably to add an extra 0 to the number of investments that they make and cut their check size down by a 0 or 2 zeros. I'm way over time now. The last thing that I will leave you with, and you probably can't read all of this slide, is when we think about how big the market is, we're not thinking about 500 startups. We're not even thinking about 500 startups a year. We're probably thinking about a market that's 100,000 startups a year. Now, that may seem like a fantastically stupid number to consider, but our belief system is that entrepreneurs are people, probably around 1% of the population, could be more, could be less, who can start a $10 million a year revenue business. And it might take them 3 to 5 years to get to $10 million, but that's very possible for a lot of people, arguably 70 million, 50 to 100 million people around the world. At any given time, we think there's probably 1 to 10 million of those entrepreneurs who are raising capital. If we're interested in providing them with capital, there's probably 50 to 500,000 that would help them get off the ground. Now, if you start to do the math on that, 1 million people times $50,000 is about a $50 billion a year market. If you think it's maybe 5 million people and $1 million, then it's more like a $5 trillion a year market. That's a big fucking number. In our experience, one of the people on our team can probably invest in about 20 companies a year. Maybe they'll be right about a third of the time, and maybe 5 to 15% of those will be big outcomes overall. But we think if we had maybe, 500 VCs, 500 micro VCs, and they were each doing 20 investments a year, we might be able to do 10,000 startups a year. If we had, maybe 5 to 10 of those people in 100 markets, we think we could probably fund at least 1,000 and maybe up to 10,000 companies a year. That's what we're going after. Most of those companies will be international. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that.